Hello everyone. This is the second lecture of week 12. In this video lecture, we're going to explore the city of Jerusalem as a place of memory in late antiquity, and we're going to look at the historical context from which the city and its monuments emerge. And I'd like to think about the deeper history of the city all the way back to the Babylonian kingdom and the time of the Roman Empire when the city was destroyed multiple times. The interesting thing about this history is that this kind of episodes of trauma, episodes of destruction has left a significant impact on the city itself. We see the city of Jerusalem emerging as a significant city of what we call late antiquity. Late antiquity is a transitional time period, as we mentioned in the previous video lecture. Representing transition from classical antiquity to the medieval period, particularly from the Roman Empire that united the Mediterranean to the Middle Ages, corresponding to roughly between 4th and 8th centuries of the Common Era. And it really starting with the kind of economic crisis that the Roman Empire has in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and ending with the Islamic conquest of Syria and the Middle East in the 7th and 8th centuries. So the Byzantine Empire, which is also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, existed from its flourishing in the 5th century AD all the way to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul, in 1453, emerges as a major organizing power in the political power in the Middle East. So some of which, so we're looking at the city of Jerusalem also at the time of the Byzantine Empire as well. We're going to study the capital of the Byzantine Empire next week. We're going to go to Constantinople and look at some of the imperial liturgies, imperial churches in Constantinople as well. But Byzantine emperors also sponsored a lot of building activity in Jerusalem as a holy place of Christian antiquity. So let's look at what are the main facets of this rise of Christianity in late antiquity, and what constitutes the late antique period that we're talking about. What are the certain historical moments and particular historical patterns that we associate with the late antique period in the Mediterranean? First of all, the story really begins with Constantine the Great. You're seeing a statue of him on the right, who converts to Christianity and ends practices of persecuting Christians. As you know, Christianity was very much of an underground religion under the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire, and with Constantine's conversion to Christianity, it finally became a legal religion. And this Constantine also played a very important role in the proclamation of the Edict of Milan, 313 of the Common Era, which decreed tolerance to Christianity. And the really important turning point in the history of early Christianity is the First Council of Nicaea, a council of Christian bishops convened in the city of Nicaea in Bithynia in Anatolia in 325, in the year of 325 of the common era. Um, Constantine also did another kind of really radical thing after his conversion to Christianity. He moved the capital of his empire from Rome to Byzantium, to which with a new foundation, which would later be known as Constantinople, literally the city of Constantine, or it was also referred to as Nova Roma, New Rome, which is now at modern day Istanbul. And we're going to look at Constantinople next week. And this is also the time, this is really the beginning of also the spread and institutionalization of Christianity. It's not an underground religion anymore within the Roman Empire. It also corresponds to this very interesting phenomenon of the rise of the holy man. These kind of saints and saintly figures in the countryside, wise and holy figures emerging, and with lots of stories of miracles and about them. And this is also part of a built environment, a built landscape of pilgrimage around this time as well, associated with Christianity. And this, economically speaking, if we look at more economic perspective, this is a time of hardship and economic difficulties for the cities of the Mediterranean. There's a major decline, economic decline with the end of the Roman Empire, but also the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean particularly get hit by a series of earthquakes in the 5th through 7th centuries and the bubonic plague, a big epidemic that hits these cities. And of course, crowded cities are hit much more harshly by epidemics. And so, whereas the countryside is less affected by all of this, also by the earthquakes. So there's an interesting imbalance between kind of really these declining cities which are in difficult condition and a prospering countryside. This is a really hallmark of late antiquity. If you would like, in the medieval period, we will see a revival of urbanism. The cities come back, but this is a moment that's actually there's a major decline. So it's an interesting moment for Jerusalem as a city to flourish around this time. And also, we mentioned sort of pilgrimage. You know this slide from the previous lecture. The pilgrimage really emerges at this time as an essentially late antique phenomenon and medieval, coinciding with that rise of the holy man, and coming up with its own material culture of long distance travel and pilgrimage, including pilgrims' flasks, icons, relics, and reliquaries. And these are a very powerful religious sort of flourishing of the practice of pilgrimage in late antiquity. So Jerusalem then at this time became, especially the Temple Mount that you're seeing the Dome of the Rock in the middle, which is built at the site of the Second Temple of Herod the Great, the Jewish temple, becomes really a very important place of site of destination and pilgrimage, particularly with the revival and rebuilding and construction of a series of Christian churches and cult places, really very important religious sites in Jerusalem. And because of the rich history of the sacred places in Jerusalem, for Judaism, for Christianity, and eventually for Islam, it really Jerusalem emerges as an important site of pilgrimage. If we would like to understand the sacred landscape of the Holy Land in antiquity, we have a very useful representation in our service, and that is the Madaba mosaic map that I'm showing you here in this image, which was discovered in the St. George Church in Madaba, Jordan, to the east of Jerusalem, and it dates to 6th century of the Common Era. So this is precisely the time period we're talking about Jerusalem emerging as an important place of pilgrimage in the early Byzantine period. It's a floor mosaic. It's something that you walk on, a very large map that is where you see Jerusalem. In front of that person that you're seeing is the representation of Jerusalem massively depicted in this composition. It's dated to 542 of the Common Era by unknown artists, located on the apse, on the floor of the apse of the church, oriented northwards, and it covers in a region from all the way from Lebanon to the Nile Delta, including the Dead Sea. So all landscapes elements within the Madaba map have explanations and place names inscribed in Greek. Jerusalem itself emerges as an important site with its grandeur. You can see columnar sort of central street crossing the city, with big Roman porticos that were built within the city itself. So this brings back this representation of Jerusalem in the Madaba mosaic map brings us back to the question of memory, and which I would like to argue here in this context is something that is not precisely the consumption of the past, but I'd like to argue to understand memory here as a creative production of the past, and therefore not an individual act, but something that's shared and collective. Also, we're talking about places of memory places, specifically in Jerusalem, specific places charged and sometimes even overcharged with historic significance in Jerusalem, and these shared memories associated particularly with religious histories are anchored to special places that are also places that then become places of belonging. And therefore, because they become quickly, they are transformed into being places of belonging and attachment, personal and collective attachment. They also become potential sites for collective identity and political conflict. And this is something that we see a lot in the history of Jerusalem. And in this history, I mentioned a kind of a series of traumatic events that we know has really has shaped the history of Jerusalem in that sense, as a city of multiple destructions. And these kind of memories of the catastrophe, they're so embedded within the theory that within the history of the city is that these episodes of destruction are actually represented in art. and I'm showing you an illustration from the Nuremberg Chronicle dating to 1493 that tells us an historical account of the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonian kings, the Neo-Babylonian rulers. And we've looked at the Neo-Babylonian rulers when we were discussing Babylon, if you remember. So we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar II, Nabopolassar, who actually were very active in kind of this kind of military conquest, as well as movement of communities, mass deportations of people. And this was one of the things that Jerusalem was exposed to. So if we take a quick look at this history of violence in Jerusalem, this is a kind of a really interesting history that leaves a lot of traces within Jerusalem. In the as I mentioned, the Assyrian and Babylonian military subjection of Jerusalem is part of the story. Particularly, the destruction of the first temple was associated with Nebuchadnezzar II. We talked about him as who's also the builder king in Babylon, who built a majority of the city where the Akitu festival was celebrated. And then a really important figure emerges with the kind of during the Roman Republic, Herod the Great, whose father had really great relationships with Julius Caesar. So you want to think about him in the sort of really in the final years of the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire. He was a vassal king of the Romans, appointed as the king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. He was an important builder. He sponsored many building projects, and one of his sort of major building projects was, of course, the expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, also known as, historically known as the Herod's Temple, and the construction of a port as well at Caesarea Maritima, and the fortresses at Masada and Herodium as well. Then actually things go worse as we move through in the early century, in the first century of the establishment of the Roman Empire. At the time of Titus, there is a Jewish revolt, particularly with anti-taxation protests and attacks on Roman citizens. So the Romans actually make a military intervention here, and this is pretty catastrophic for the Jewish community in Jerusalem. And then the third Jewish revolt, which was in 136 of the Common Era, and that takes place at the time of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, and that leads to a major urban planning and reconstruction that takes place after that destruction actually takes place. So all of these different episodes of sometimes construction, sometimes destruction, particularly the oppressive regime of the Roman Empire, has left important traces within the history of the city. There's the famous story about this Masada fortress that was built by Herod the Great in 173 AD. A group of Jewish rebels flee Jerusalem, sacked and destroyed by the Roman army, and they take refuge at Masada, the fortress near the Dead Sea. Besieged by the army, they don't want to give up, and they commit suicide rather than surrendering to Rome. So they become a kind of this heroic story, and the kind of really is heavily used as the kind of foundational myth for the modern state of Israel and Israeli national identity these days. And I wanted to show you this Arch of Titus, which is really quite interesting. The triumphal arch that was built by Domitian, who was Titus's brother, in honor of his dead brother Titus, who actually organized a military expedition to Jerusalem and the sack of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, and celebrating that victory over Jerusalem, and it was built in 82 AD after his brother Titus's death. Within this triumphal arch, we see a representation. This is a very well-known relief that depicts very vividly the destruction of the Jewish temple and the carrying off of the sacking of the temple, with its ritual paraphernalia being taken away by the Roman soldiers. This kind of traumatic and painful history of Jerusalem prior to late antiquity left then a major mark in the city, and never forgotten. And the mourning for the destruction of the Herod's temple, and the Jews not being the city community not being allowed to the Temple Mount during this sort of Roman occupation, actually was commemorated and mourned at this Wailing Wall that we looked at in the last lecture as well. So I'm going to wrap up my lecture here, and in the next lecture we're going to look more closely on the specific revival and reconstruction of some Christian buildings and reconfiguration of the urban landscape of Jerusalem in late antiquity.